Welcome to Conspiracy Q. Each week we take on, one of history's biggest conspiracies.
And today we're going deep, really deep into 9/11.
Yeah. Specifically some recently uncovered or classified sources that they really challenge. They challenge that, the official story of what happened that day.
Yeah, and it's heavy stuff. I mean, we're talking about the possibility that the World Trade Center towers weren't just brought down by the plane impacts and the fires, but maybe by a controlled demolition.
A controlled demolition. I mean, that's huge, and that's what we're going to try to unpack today, right?
That's our mission.
Yeah, was it really just a terrorist attack? Or was something else, something darker going on, something maybe even orchestrated, I don't know, from within?
Yeah, possibly. And your sources, they lay out a lot of evidence that points to that possibility. We're going to look at, the physics of how those buildings came down, especially WTC-7, that's a whole other can of worms. We'll hear from eyewitnesses, talk about scientific findings, things that suggest explosives were used.
Explosives. Wow. Okay, keep going.
And then there's the actions, the motives of some key players, things that just don't add up. And then, of course, the big one, the 9/11 Commission report. We'll look at that and some of the criticisms of how that whole thing was handled.
Okay, so strap yourselves in, folks. We're about to go deep into some very controversial territory. I mean, are you ready to have your whole understanding of 9/11 flipped on its head?
Well, let's start with the physics,
Yeah.
because when you look at how those towers collapsed, especially WTC-7, something doesn't sit right.
Right.
Take WTC-7, for example. I mean, that was a 47-story skyscraper. The plane didn't even hit it, but it collapsed. Perfectly symmetrical in under 7 seconds.
7 seconds. I mean, come on.
It's crazy, right? And the NIST report, after a lot of back and forth, and people like physicist David Chandler really pushing them on it, they admitted there was a period, it was 2.25 seconds of free fall acceleration.
Okay, but I'm not a physicist. What does that mean, free fall? And why is that so strange in this case?
Okay, think about it like this. Like you drop a bowling ball, right? It just falls straight down, nothing slowing it down. But imagine that same bowling ball having to smash through layers and layers of shelves on its way down.
It'd be way slower.
Exactly. It would take much longer. But with WTC-7, it's like those shelves just weren't there. For those 2 seconds, there was zero resistance. Like the support columns just vanished.
And that doesn't happen when a building's just, damaged by fire.
Nope, not at all.
Wow, that's freaky. And it wasn't just WTC-7. The sources also talk about all these reports of molten steel found in the rubble weeks after the towers came down.
Right. And there are tons of eyewitness accounts, firefighters, first responders. They all describe seeing rivers of molten steel.
Rivers. That's a crazy image.
Yeah, it's intense. But here's the thing. Jet fuel, even though it burns super hot, it doesn't get hot enough to melt steel.
Doesn't it?
No. Steel melts at something like 2,750 degrees Fahrenheit. But jet fuel, it burns at, between 980 and 1,500.
Yeah.
Big difference. So for there to be molten steel, something else must have been burning. Something way hotter.
Makes you wonder what could have caused that kind of heat. And your sources, they suggest nanothermite, right?
Yeah, that's a big one. See, there were traces of nanothermite found in dust samples from the World Trade Center site. And this stuff, it's not, something you find lying around.
Right.
Nanothermite, it's a military-grade incendiary. It burns super hot, super fast, and it can cut through steel like butter.
Wow.
Yeah. And finding it in the WTC dust, that suggests explosives were used. Explosives designed to take down those steel structures.
Yeah, that's not your typical office fire aftermath, is it?
Nope.
So we've got a skyscraper falling at free fall speed, molten steel, military-grade explosives. What about the pancake theory? The official explanation for how the Twin Towers came down. Does that hold up in light of all this?
Honestly, it struggles. The pancake theory, basically it says the plane impacts and the fires, they weaken the floors, and then they just started collapsing one on top of the other like pancakes. But that doesn't explain everything we saw.
Doesn't it?
No, because the towers, they didn't just crumble, they imploded. They came straight down, almost perfectly symmetrical. And the amount of concrete, the way it was pulverized, turned into dust, that doesn't happen with a simple gravity collapse.
No, it's much more violent than that.
Yeah, and then there are the core columns, the massive steel columns that ran through the center of each tower. They were designed to hold, incredible weight. The pancake theory, it doesn't explain how those columns just disintegrated the way they did.
So the physics alone, they raise so many red flags. And then we have NORAD and how they supposedly failed to intercept those planes. I mean, how is that even possible?
It's one of the most baffling parts of this whole thing. 4 planes, of course, for, I mean, some of them, over an hour, and NORAD, they didn't react in time. That's crazy. Usually they scramble jets within like 10 to 15 minutes if a plane deviates from its flight path. But on 9/11, nothing.
And according to your sources, they were even running drills that day, drills where hijacked planes were crashing into buildings.
I know. It's almost too much of a coincidence. Something just doesn't add up there. It's like a failure of epic proportions, whether it's a communication breakdown or something more deliberate.
It gives you chills, that's for sure. Then there's the mystery of the missing black boxes. Officially, they said they never recovered any from the World Trade Center flights, but these sources, they suggest otherwise.
Right. There are people, FBI agents, recovery workers, who claim that they did find black boxes at the crash sites. And that contradicts what the government's been saying all along. Those boxes, they're built to survive pretty much anything. It's weird that they just vanished. What was on those recordings that they didn't want us to hear?
Yeah, the cockpit recordings, I mean, that would have been crucial evidence.
Exactly.
And your sources really emphasize the reports of explosions. And not just, after the planes hit, but before and during the collapse.
Yeah, it's not just a few people. It's dozens. I mean, firefighters, police officers, people who were in those buildings, they all talk about hearing these distinct explosions. They describe them as, secondary explosions, one after another, or a series of, boom, boom, boom sounds. Some even said it sounded like a demolition.
A demolition, wow.
And you have to wonder, why weren't these reports taken more seriously? They just kind of got brushed aside in the official reports.
So it's like we keep seeing this pattern, right? Physical evidence that doesn't fit, ignored eyewitness accounts, procedures not followed. It's a lot to process. And then there's the whole issue of, what your sources call vanishing witnesses and silenced experts, people like Barry Jennings, who had a very disturbing story to tell.
Barry Jennings, his case is really troubling. He was a high-ranking official, the deputy director of emergency services for New York City, and he was in WTC-7 on 9/11. He was trapped there, and he said that he heard and felt explosions inside the building.
Inside WTC-7.
Yes, inside WTC-7 before either of the Twin Towers even came down.
That changes the timeline completely.
Right, and the creepiest part is that he died suddenly in 2008, just days before the final NIST report on WTC-7 was released.
What? Are you serious? What was the cause of death?
They never released it.
That's so suspicious.
It's hard to ignore the timing.
And then there's William Rodriguez. He was the last person pulled alive from the North Tower.
A true hero.
A hero? Absolutely.
But he also had a story to tell, right?
Yes, and his story, it was basically ignored by the 9/11 Commission. He said he felt this massive explosion in the basement of the North Tower before the plane even hit.
Before the plane hit. So what, you're saying the official timeline is wrong?
Well, his testimony suggests that the destruction might have started somewhere else, not just from the impact zone. And it wasn't just him, There's a whole group of professionals, engineers, architects, thousands of them, who say that the evidence points to controlled demolition. They form this group, Engineers and Architects for 9/11 Truth.
So these aren't like random people on the internet. These are experts in their field.
Right, people who understand how buildings work, how they collapse, and they're saying the official explanation just doesn't make sense. But they've been pretty much ignored by the mainstream media.
So we've got the physics, the eyewitness accounts, and now these experts all saying something's off. And then you bring in the financial side of things, and it gets even weirder. Like the stock market, all those put options on those airlines. Yeah, that's a really interesting piece of this puzzle. In the days before 9/11, there was this huge surge in people buying put options on United and American Airlines stock.
Put options, meaning they were betting those stocks would go down. Yeah.
Exactly. Like they knew something was about to happen that would cause those stocks to plummet. The 9/11 Commission, they looked into it, but they said it was just a coincidence.
A coincidence? Come on.
I know. It seems pretty far-fetched. And it wasn't just the airlines. Remember that announcement about the missing money from the Pentagon?
Yeah, wasn't that like $2 trillion or something?
Yeah, something like that. Donald Rumsfeld, he announced it on September 10th, the day before the attacks. He said $2.3 trillion was missing from the Pentagon budget.
Missing? What does that even mean?
It means nobody knew where it went. And then guess what? The next day, the Pentagon gets hit. And the area where they kept the records about this missing money, it was destroyed.
That's too convenient. And then there's Larry Silverstein, the guy who leased the World Trade Center complex just weeks before 9/11.
Yeah, he's a key figure in all of this. He took out this insurance policy, and it specifically covered terrorist attacks.
So he made a lot of money when the towers came down, right?
He did. He ended up getting over $4.5 billion from the insurance companies.
Wow.
And then there's this video clip from a PBS documentary where Silverstein, he's talking about WTC-7, and he says, I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me they weren't sure they could contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life, maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse.
Pull it. What does that even mean?
Pull it is a term they use in the demolition industry. It means to bring down a building in a controlled demolition.
Oh, wow.
Silverstein later said he meant something else, like pulling the firefighters out. But his initial wording, it's very suggestive.
It's really hard to explain away. So with all this crazy evidence, all these unanswered questions, what does your source material say about the 9/11 Commission report?
Well, they're not very kind to it.
Mm-hmm.
They say the commission was underfunded, they didn't have enough power to really investigate things, and a lot of the people on the commission, they were connected to the Bush administration.
So there's a conflict of interest there.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And the craziest thing is, the report, it doesn't even mention the collapse of WTC-7. I mean, a 47-story skyscraper falling like that, and they just ignore it.
That's insane.
And then you have the families of the victims. They formed this group, the 9/11 Family Steering Committee, and they submitted thousands of questions to the commission, questions that were never answered. They felt like the whole investigation was rushed and that the truth was being swept under the rug.
It definitely feels like they were trying to control the narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that brings up another question. Who benefited from all this? Who had the most to gain?
Right, who profited?
Well, the sources point to a few groups. Defense contractors, for example, their budgets went way up after 9/11. Oil companies, too. And then there are the security agencies. They got more power, more surveillance capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, there were the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right, those wars made some people very rich.
Exactly. So the sources are saying that maybe 9/11 was used as an excuse to push through these pre-existing agendas.
It's a dark thought, but it kind of makes sense,
It does, unfortunately.
Now, you mentioned something called Operation Falling Towers. It's like this top-secret dossier that's included in your sources. What's that all about?
This dossier, it really dives deep into the controlled demolition theory. It goes over a lot of the things we've already talked about, the freefall collapse, the molten metal, the nanothermite, and it just keeps hammering home the point that those buildings were brought down on purpose.
Okay, but who would have done it?
Yeah.
And how?
Well, the dossier lays out some pretty shocking possibilities. It brings up Larry Silverstein again and his pull it comment. It also talks about insider trading, like maybe some people knew about the attacks beforehand and made a ton of money off it.
Insider trading, that's illegal.
It is. And then there are these reports, they're unconfirmed, but they talk about power being shut down at the World Trade Center in the days leading up to 9/11.
Why would they do that?
Well, it would give people access to the buildings, wouldn't it? Maybe to plant explosives. And then there were those elevator modernization projects that were happening right before the attacks.
Maybe those were a cover?
The dossier suggests that, yeah, maybe they were using those projects as a way to get explosives into the buildings.
That's crazy.
And then the dossier goes on to talk about, like, how the media was controlled, how certain stories were suppressed, how witnesses were silenced, or even died under mysterious circumstances, like Barry Jennings.
Right. And what about that BBC reporter, the one who announced that WTC-7 had collapsed while it was still standing in the background?
Jane Stanley.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was strange. It's like she had a script and she was reading it, even though what she was saying didn't match what was happening in real life.
Like someone was telling her what to say.
It's possible.
And the dossier, it focuses a lot on WTC-7, doesn't it? Like, that building is like the smoking gun.
It's the one that really can't be explained away by the official story. It wasn't hit by a plane, but it came down in free fall. And it just so happened to house some very important offices. The SEC was in there, the Securities and Exchange Commission.
So they were investigating financial crimes.
Exactly. And some people believe that the SEC was getting too close to uncovering something big, something that powerful people didn't want them to find out.
And the CIA was in there too, right?
Yeah, they had a secret office in WTC-7 and the Secret Service. And then, of course, Larry Silverstein made a fortune off that building collapsing.
So the dossier saying that WTC-7 was targeted for a reason.
That's what it's suggesting, yeah. And it also brings up, the intelligence failures, how NORAD just stood down, how they ignored all those warnings about a possible attack.
Like they let it happen on purpose.
The dossier doesn't say for sure, but it implies that maybe some people in the intelligence community knew about the attacks beforehand and chose to, look the other way.
That's terrifying.
It is. And it also raises questions about who those hijackers really were and whether they were even capable of pulling off such a sophisticated operation.
Yeah, some of the information about the hijackers, it just doesn't add up. So it's not just about the buildings themselves, it's about the whole system, the whole power structure that might have been involved. And the dossier, it wraps things up by going back to the follow the money angle.
Yeah, it talks about how those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they made certain people very rich. And it connects this back to something called PNA, the Project for the New American Century.
PNA, what's that?
It was a think tank, a group of neoconservative policymakers. And back in 1997, they wrote this report where they said that America needed a new Pearl Harbor in order to justify increasing military spending and expanding its global influence.
A new Pearl Harbor, like another major attack.
Yeah. And then, a few years later, 9/11 happens, and they get exactly what they wanted. The dossier is basically saying that 9/11 was the excuse they needed to push through their agenda. And then you have the Patriot Act, which was passed really quickly after the attacks.
Right, the Patriot Act, that gave the government all sorts of new powers to spy on people.
Yeah, and the dossier argues that that was all part of the plan, too, to use fear and chaos to restrict our freedoms and consolidate power.
That's a pretty bleak picture.
It is, but it's a perspective that a lot of people believe in.
So this dossier, it's really laying out an alternative history of 9/11, and it's not just theories. They have some, alleged evidence, too, right? Like those leaked emails and memos.
Right. The sources include what they say are excerpts from real emails and memos. And some of this stuff, it's pretty incriminating. Like, there's one email that talks about something called Project Norseman Greenlight.
Norseman Greenlight, what is that?
Nobody knows for sure, but the email also mentions Pinnacle, which some people think was a code name for the World Trade Center. And it talks about using external actors for cover narrative. It sounds like they're talking about setting up a false flag operation.
Whoa.
And then there's another memo that talks about granting after-hours access to the World Trade Center for maintenance crews in the days before 9/11. And it also mentions disabling security cameras, like they were trying to create a window where something could happen without being recorded.
That's so creepy.
Yeah, and then there's this email. It's talking about an unprecedented opportunity and advising on substantial puts on airline stocks, like someone knew that those stocks were about to crash. And then there's this memo. It seems to be instructing the media on how to report on the collapses. It says they should emphasize structural failure due to fire and downplay any other theories.
So they were trying to control the narrative from the very beginning.
That's what these emails and memos suggest, yeah.
It's like they had a plan all along.
And the sources, they also include this timeline of suspicious events, which kind of ties everything together. It starts with that PNAC report from 1997, the one that talked about a new Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
Then
it goes on to mention that NORAD drill in June 2001, the one that was eerily similar to the actual attacks. And then there's that presidential daily briefing in August 2001, the one that warned about Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda planning attacks inside the U.S.
Did they, ignore that warning?
Apparently. The timeline also includes the surge in put options on airline stocks, the power outages at the World Trade Center, the SEC moving its files into WTC-7, the collapses themselves, the molten steel reports, the Taliban offering to hand over bin Laden and the U.S. refusing, and then Barry Jennings' death. It's a long list of events, and some of them are just too weird to ignore.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's all just coincidence. And your sources, they also have a whole section called Who's Who, listing all these shadowy figures. Who are these people, and what are they supposed to have done?
Well, it's basically a list of people who, according to these sources, might have been involved in the conspiracy or at least had knowledge of it. It includes people like Dick Cheney, who was the vice president at the time.
Powerful guy.
Very powerful. And his company, Halliburton, they made a lot of money off the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right.
And then there's Larry Silverstein, of course, and Donald Rumsfeld, who was in charge of the Pentagon, and George Tenet, the head of the CIA, and Philip Zelikow, who ran the 9/11 Commission, and Marvin Bush, President Bush's brother, who was involved in security at the World Trade Center, and Michael Hess, who was with Barry Jennings in WTC-7. And then there's some unnamed contractors who were working on those elevator modernization projects. The sources are basically saying that all these people, they were connected in some way, and they might have played a role in what happened on 9/11.
Wow. That's a lot to take in. I mean, after going through all this evidence, these theories, it's hard to know what to think.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. But that's kind of the point, isn't it?
Right.
To make you question everything.
Right, right.
To look at the official narrative, the one we've all been told for so long, and ask ourselves, is this really the whole story? Or is there something more, something they don't want us to know?
It's unsettling for sure.
It is. But it's important to ask these questions, to be skeptical, to keep searching for the truth.
So, what now? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the most important thing is to keep learning, to keep researching, to keep an open mind. Don't just accept what you're told. Look for yourself. There's so much information out there, especially now with the internet. You can find documents, videos, testimonies, all sorts of things that the mainstream media doesn't want you to see.
So you're saying we should do our own research.
Absolutely.
Don't just trust the official story.
Exactly. Because if something's not right, if something's being hidden, it's our responsibility to find out what it is.
That's a lot of responsibility.
It is. But it's also empowering to know that we're not just passive consumers of information, that we
Yeah.
can think for ourselves, that we can challenge authority.
Right, right.
That's what this show is all about.
It is. It's about questioning everything.
And it's about finding the truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be.
So, to all of you listening out there, thank you for joining us on Conspiracy Q.
We hope we've given you something to think about.
And if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out the sources we used for this episode. We'll have links to them on our website.
And please rate and follow us. We need your support to keep bringing you these important stories.
Absolutely. And until next time, keep questioning everything.
Keep digging, keep searching. The truth is out there.
But you got to work for it. It's not just going to come to you.
And one final thought. If the official story about 9/11 is so solid, so airtight, why are so many people still questioning it? Why are there still so many unanswered questions? What are they so afraid of us finding out?